Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm Senior Fellow with the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative and also the Director of the Turkey Program. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event to discuss a recently launched Frontier Europe report on China. The report is addressing the question of China's role in the Black Sea. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China seeks to play a larger role in the Black Sea region, and it has been wooing the countries, the Black Sea countries, in hopes of securing new markets for its goods and investing in infrastructure projects. But there's a lot of concern. The worry is that there's more to Chinese actions in the region than meets the eye, particularly in the Western capital. So the worry is that China will increase its political and diplomatic clout in the region that is considered vital for Russian interest, and this will create tension between Moscow and Washington. So to discuss the report and China's prospective role in the Black Sea, I'm pleased to introduce a panel of experts. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Gunter. He is a professor of political science at Tennessee Technological University, and he recently published an article in World Affairs on Chinese naval strategy. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Michal Meidan. She is the director of the China Energy Program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. She's one of the contributing authors to the recent Frontier China report. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Ivan Safranchuk. He is a senior fellow at the Institute of International Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and he's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also one of the contributing authors to the report. So welcome, thank you so much. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, and you can all find that on your screens. And for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events.mei.edu. And also please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be looking at them, and I will factor as many as possible into the discussion. So with that, let's begin. Again, thank you all. I'm looking forward to this discussion. China is not something that follow, but Frontier Europe Initiative does, and I'm a resident fellow there, so I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I want to start with you, Michael, referring to your recent report. So historically, China had little interest in sea power, but recently it has developed a blue water navy. And judging by the overall tonnage, it became the largest navy in the world. So can you briefly outline for us some of the major trains of thought that have led to China's involvement in the Black Sea region, among others?
Thank you very much. As you know, historically, China saw itself as the middle kingdom in the world, and therefore really had no need to go around the world exploring and so forth, although of course the Silk Road 2,000 years ago, all the more China had no interest in naval power, except for the brief period in the early 1400s under the famous Admiral Zheng Zhou, who reached the shores of Africa in the early 1400s with huge ships that dwarfed the European ships. But just a few decades later, started off from Europe going towards China the other way, Portugal and Vasco da Gama. Now, fast forward, in modern times, China has really stunned the world, but frankly not historians, by becoming very quickly a great power, maybe the great power in the world. And along with that means you have to have a blue water navy. That means a navy that goes around the world. And this, in some ways, I think can be seen as a modern day updated version of the ancient Silk Road, which took Chinese goods from China westward all the way to Europe and on to other places like North Africa and the Middle East. If you look at a map, you'll see that although the Black Sea looks like it's a rather obscure backwater, the Black Sea was on the way of the ancient Silk Road and is strategically located near the outlets to the Mediterranean and to also Europe. Now, very briefly, in considering how the Chinese have put together a magnificent navy in modern times, I think part of the background here is studying the famous American naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote in the latter part of the 19th century about the value of a navy. The oceans are frictionless. The frictionless sea, it's a world highway. It's the world commons. And it's much easier to move across the waters than it is to move across land with cumbersome armies. So following the strategies of this American Admiral Mahan, China, as a great power, felt that it was necessary to have a first-class blue water navy. And amazingly, as just this year, according to some statistics, in terms of actual.
Michael, I'm very sorry for interrupting you, but we can't hear you very well. Do you mind moving closer to the computer?
Okay, I don't know what the problem is. Did I pick up somewhere about, I'm talking, can you hear me better?
Slightly.
I don't know what to do. I'll talk louder in my professorial voice.
That's better. Yeah.
A little better. Okay, I was talking about the influence of Admiral Mahan, the American naval strategist, whom I think the Chinese have taken lessons from on the value of having a navy. A navy crosses the frictionless sea, the world highways, without the cumbersome problems of a land army. And the Navy facilitates trade, and world trade, facilitates becoming a great power. So inevitably, as a great power, and I see nothing wrong with this, China has involved itself in the Black Sea littoral area and with the surrounding, well, the littoral states, including, of course, most importantly, Turkey and Russia. So that would be a brief background to why, of all things, the Chinese Navy has shown up in the Black Sea.
Well, thank you for that. I have follow-up questions, but I want to turn to Michal now. Michal, from an energy point of view, how important is the Black Sea to China?
It's a really interesting question, and thank you, Gunnar, also for the opportunity to be here and to contribute to the publication. I'll do a bit of a detour before coming to the Black Sea and the energy importance, because typically sort of I've looked at China and Central Asia and China in the Middle East, and then when energy comes up, you know, we have to bear in mind that China in the scope of 30 years has gone from self-reliant and mainly consuming coal and exporting oil to a country that is now the world's largest importer of crude oil. It accounts for almost 15% of global oil demand, roughly 8% of gas demand, and the biggest source of sort of incremental demand. And that again in the scope of 30 years. And this reliance on seaborne flows of oil and gas has really led to a huge amount of concerns about energy security. One of the driving factors for the development of the Blue Water Navy and China's sort of desire to protect its interests, commercial and energy as well. And so typically when you look at China's sort of overseas investments or sort of the way it thinks about energy and its supply sources, then there are these questions of, you know, how is China securing its access to energy resources? and yet it's all absent from the Black Sea. And it's a really interesting test case because it's sort of nestled between Central Asia and the Middle East. And yet China has very little energy interests in that region. And that is because the Black Sea states do not really supply China with energy, with the exception of Russia. But the resources that go to China aren't on the Black Sea side of Russia. And so really, it's not a big supplier of energy, neither oil or gas, to China. Again, China has historically invested in overseas assets to secure assets, to have operational capacity, to be sort of a participant in the pricing mechanisms and in kind of the entire value chain. And yet it hasn't invested in the Black Sea on the energy front, in large part because the resource base is unknown and uncertain. And whatever is developed, and there have been, recently developments in gas offshore Turkey and other countries, but the assumption is that whatever is produced will be consumed probably locally or even go to sort of Europe. So the question of the Black Sea as an energy provider for China has not really come up, and that potential is very limited. And even as a transit route, again, for the EU, the Black Sea is critical as a transit route. For energy, it's not really significant for China because, again, the Central Asian resources go west to China. Middle Eastern resources will usually go via sort of maritime routes, and any potential pipelines that could be built wouldn't go through the Black Sea. And so it's a little bit of an energy black hole, so to speak, for China, and one in which, in terms of fossil fuels, it's had very limited interest or appetite to engage in. And I think as we look forward, even though China's oil appetite and certainly gas demand are continuing to grow, oil demand is probably going to peak over the next decade. And so investing in these resources and in these transport routes that are lengthy, problematic, there are concerns about the ecosystems, and there could be potentially sort of disagreements or differences of view with Russia about sort of deeper investments. They just don't seem to be worth the effort for China at this point in time.
That's very interesting. Thanks for that, for those initial remarks. Ivan, I want to turn to you next. So the assumption, especially in Western capitals, is that the global instability and the dissatisfaction with the liberal world order and American unilateralism pushed the two countries, Russia and China, together. And if you look at it, indeed, they have cooperated closely on many issues. And on top of that, there's a personal chemistry between the Russian and Chinese presidents, which helped strengthen that partnership. Russia and China often form a bloc at the United Nations, and they're members of organizations that do not include the United States. So please give us a little background on this global convergence, whether this is a strategic partnership or not, and then I'll ask you specifically about the Black Sea.
Russia prefers to name relations with China exactly as strategic partnership. This is the term used in official documents. However, in China, it's also common to say, to define these relations like standing back to back on the international arena. So it doesn't mean, and I like this Chinese definition a little bit more, because it doesn't mean that Russia and China always look in the same direction, but they keep backs of each other safe, standing back to back on the international arena, as the Chinese often say. It's a little bit paradoxical that Russia and China, both being beneficiaries of the economic globalization, were never particularly welcoming what is called liberal world order, a sort of political framework for the economic globalization. Of course, China was far more beneficiary of the economic globalization, Russia far less, but still Russia, like many other exporters of natural resources and developing countries, was very much beneficiary of the period of high energy prices, which was exactly the consequence of economic globalization. So China was more low profile in its opposition to the liberal world order. Russia was much more open in its opposition to the liberal world order, but their mindsets on the liberal world order coincided from something like 90s. It's only the difference is only that Russia was more vocal and China less vocal. But as you rightly pointed out, after President Xi came to power in China, the Chinese foreign policy became far more assertive. And we can expect that with the further evolution of the Chinese foreign policy and with a younger generation more nationalistic and more assertive coming to power, taking more posts, the Chinese policy will be even more assertive. And exactly, President Xi and President Putin have very good personal chemistry, personal and political chemistry. And we witness very big convergence in Russian and Chinese views on world affairs, big political issues on the international arena, and we do not see them competing on the global level.
But aside from that joint mindset, what are some of the issues that leads to this convergence?
I think that the mindset, which you try to put a little bit aside, is still very important. This political philosophy, which makes people believe something and behave accordingly, is very important. Not only people, but also nations believe in something. So, but if you want to go to more practical level, I think that Russia and China were very much pushed to each other by the period of American unilateralism in the 2000 years. And the new cycle of unilateralism under President Trump pushed them even further together. So on practical level, Russia and China do not want everything to be decided by the United States, either alone or even with European and Asian formal allies. Russia and China want very much the Security Council, where they have veto the Security Council of the United Nations, to have more role on global issues than Western alliances and organizations of the liberal world order.
I'll ask a question specifically about the Black Sea, but Michael,
I'm off the screen. Can you get me back on? I don't know how. I can hear what's going on, but I'm not pictured.
we can see you.
I can't see you.
Oh,
it doesn't matter. Can you hear me?
okay. No, we can hear you fine. And I'm sorry, I'm not a technologically gifted person myself, but maybe my colleagues, younger colleagues, could help you, Colin. But we can hear you fine.
Okay, great.
So we can. So my next question is, what is the Chinese end game in the Black Sea from a military point of view, if there is one?
Well, it remains to be seen, of course, but to me it seems that the Chinese are in the Black Sea as a sort of a corollary to a much bigger game, which is to connect with Europe and the Mediterranean. So, and of course, Russia and Turkey are Black Sea littoral states, but the connection between China and Russia and Turkey does not have to be in the Black Sea. I mean, it does interest me, though, that just this past summer, Turkey apparently has made huge discoveries of oil and gas resources in the southern part of the Black Sea, which in the long run, or maybe the middle run, will interest China too. On the other hand, I agree that in the not too distant future, oil and gas are a declining resource. And so I don't know that that would be so much of interest. So I see the Chinese interest in the Black Sea as being ancillary and secondary. It doesn't mean it's not going to be of some importance, but I would think that it would be more of interest in Chinese to be coming through the Indian Ocean, up through Red Sea, into the Mediterranean Sea, using ports such as near Izmir and Piraeus in Greece and on to Greece in Italy and into Europe and northern Africa. So that would be my tentative comment.
Sorry, I keep doing this. So there's a question from the audience about whether Chinese interest, again, from a military point of view in the region would change the balance of naval forces in the region.
I doubt that. I think China has much more important places to be concentrating militarily, such as the South China Sea, with the various problems with the United States in the South China Sea, and that the Black Sea would be an area where the Chinese involvement is not going to be something that's going to dramatically change the balance of power there.
Michal, going back to you, you said that China was not very much interested in the Black Sea's fossil fuel potential, but can the region become a future source of supplies to China?
And for fossil fuels, I doubt it. I mean, if there is a huge discovery offshore Turkey, then potentially, especially if, you know, the global market is trending towards more LNG, more flexible markets that looks a bit more like the oil markets, where, you know, trading is less on term contracts and pipelines, but more on kind of spot cargoes, then potentially. But then there's less of a strategic element there, right? If China can't lock in, so to speak, those resources to ensure that they go to China, then there's a limited, again, strategic element that goes into it. And so it does feel like, certainly not on the oil side, the resources and the reserves that have been, you know, there have been a few explorations offshore, and those seem to be relatively limited. Gas could be a slightly different picture, and the time horizon for gas consumption in China is longer than for oil. But overall, it does seem like there's limited scope there. Again, it's not just the resource potential, but then the transport routes, the costs associated with it, and whether it makes sense for China to sort of deploy, call it China Inc., right? The state banks, the state-owned companies, and try to ensure access to those reserves. If you compare it to Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, even North America, there's a greater strategic importance, I think, to securing those reserves and the access to those, again, be it through global markets and market mechanisms, or through sort of more strategic integration. And again, I think there's also one thing that we need to be clear on here, that a lot of China's sort of energy diplomacy, I think we have this vision of China as a monolith, you know, the leaders in Beijing sitting there and directing the corporate pawns all over the globe. And it's not actually like that. I mean, there are more interests and more factors that operate when there is a robust sort of policy framework like the Belt and Road Initiative that facilitates financing, facilitates access to deals or to resources. Then of course it helps to mobilize the corporate actors. But we shouldn't assume that sort of whatever Xi Jinping or the leaders in Beijing say, then everybody has their marching orders and they work accordingly. And so it's often a much more messy process. And again, they look at commercial interests just as much as they look at sort of political and strategic interests. But in energy, in fossil fuels in the Black Sea, there's neither sort of commercial a sort of a real commercial interest or a strategic interest as it relates to energy. I agree 100% that the Black Sea and its location is part of the broader sort of geopolitical landscape of the Belt and Road and of the connectivity. And so it's not to understate that, but the energy part of it is just not there.
Ivan, you gave us a brief overview of what Chinese and Russian thinking is in terms of global geopolitical issues, but how is Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Black Sea? Are the two countries growing more united? And if so, what would that mean for the United States? And Michael, feel free to weigh in on that.
That's a very good question, because what we saw before recent years was that China and Russia converged globally, but very much diverged on regional issues. In regional political situations in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in Eastern Europe, there was no common position between Russia and China. Moreover, sometimes they were even competing between themselves. It's clear that China is extending interests in the territories which Russia takes for being territories of its privileged interests, economic and political. China did not pay attention to it for quite long. Just a few examples. Russia was at serious odds with Georgia. There was a military conflict. China was quite neutral on the issue, but practically China was cooperating a lot with Georgia. So Russia was pressing Georgia with sanctions, let alone the military conflict. And China was increasing economic cooperation, clearly helping by that to Georgia a lot. The same, more or less the same in Ukraine. While Russia was trying to push Ukraine into closer regional integration, China was, on the contrary, providing other than integration opportunities for Ukraine. However, after 2014, we see that China helped Russia a lot in the Black Sea in a few situations. And it's clear that in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis, China did provide meaningful assistance to Russia in the Black Sea, and it looks like they became far more united in the Black Sea than usually they are in the regional situations. And my interpretation for that, my explanatory model, is that China takes their Black Sea situation now not as a regional situation, but as a facet of the global great power competition. And in the global great power competition, Russia and China are converged. And my question is, and my hypothesis is, that the same may happen in other regional situations under the same conditions. If China reinterprets some regional situations as being not regional by nature, but just a facet of global competition, Russia and China may converge not only globally, but also regionally.
But why after Crimea? I mean, why has other regional conflicts changed the thinking in China in terms of how it works with Russia or clashes with Russia on regional matters?
Because the last 5 years, in connection to Ukraine, that was very clearly not a regional situation. It was very much a more global situation, whether it was violation of the international order and the big assault on the liberal world order as it is interpreted in the West, or whether it was aggravation of a great power competition by the United States as Russia sees it. Nonetheless, it's clear that both Russia and the United States were taking what is happening around the Ukrainian situation not as a regional issue, but as a global issue, an issue decisive for the world order. And China then interpreted it in the same way.
So, so Chinese-Russian cooperation on regional matters is a factor of Western response to whatever China is doing.
Yes. Militarily, before Michael addresses it, militarily, by the way, Russia and China held exercises in the Black Sea in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis. However, those exercises, you can interpret them differently. It's like the glass is half empty or half full. On the one hand, the very fact of military exercises is important. On the other hand, you can clearly see that China wanted to downscale these exercises, to make them military, but at the same time as symbolic as possible. So it's clear that China is still committed to avoiding geopolitical competition prevailing. China still wants economic issues to prevail and not being overtaken by geopolitical competition. So China still hopes that is possible. But when that hope fails, it looks like they are ready to converge with Russia in a more meaningful way.
It's very interesting. Go ahead.
I would think that there would be a problem between Russia and China, because with China's emergence as a great power and Russia's decline from the days of the Soviet Union, China is China is encroaching on two former sole bailiwicks of Russia, namely Central Asia, which used to be part of Soviet Union Russia, is now up for grabs with the Belt and Road Initiative crossing through Central Asia. And the Black Sea was practically a Russian internal lake. And now here is China, of all things, inside the Black Sea, contesting potentially with Russia. I don't see Russia contesting in the South China Sea with China. So as Ivan said, it's glass could be half full and half closed, but you could see that we have problems here with China becoming more and more powerful and Russia being a declining power. There is an inherent possibility of strong misunderstanding here if it's not managed correctly. That's all.
Okay, Ivan, if you have nothing to add to that,
I would fully agree with the conclusion that there is inherent possibility of misunderstanding and negative developments. However, it looks like conflict between Russia and China, even with one being on the rise and the other being in decline, the conflict or serious collusion of interests is not determined. And it looks like the longer they stay together in their position to other participants of the great power competition or to the liberal world order, the more they are committed to manage their misunderstandings.
Well, Michal, there's a question for you. A question about Turkish gas discoveries in the Black Sea. So the question is, how credible do you think are the estimated numbers provided by the Turkish government? So how big is the find there? That's a question for you.
And I think these are sort of early days in the discovery process, and so every government typically, you know, tries to provide the best assessment that is possible, and then as you dig more and you drill more and you develop more, then you get further assessments. I mean, none of these resources are expected to come online before 2023. So I think these are early days, and I'm certainly no geologist, so I couldn't comment on sort of the reserve base and the reserve asset, but it does look like these are very promising reserves that could be hugely significant for Turkey. And if we look at it from the Chinese context, it just means that sort of it means that Turkey would import less, and that would free up resources from the US and from Russia that could go to China, as Turkey would consume its own its offshore resources. But obviously estimates of reserves can vary widely between between government ministries, between international agencies, and then as the development continues.
There is a question that asked, there are stories in Chinese outlets that Chinese government has chosen Baku as a trade hub to sell directly to Europe using railroads and ferries rather than crossing Red Sea and in the Indian Ocean. So the question is, would the Black Sea initiative make sense here, like the Belt and Road initiative?
And I think it's certainly the Belt and Road, the transport links, they make sense for trading, for manufactured goods and for a trading outlet. I think there's very little commodities, or at least oil and gas and oil products that trade through railroads and ferries. But again, certainly all these linkages throughout the Belt and Road make sense for China. It's the physical continuity, right, that links China to Europe and further afield. And you know, the Belt and Road isn't just about securing resources or manufacturing goods. It's also, we have to remember that when it started, it was in the context of a lot of trade deals that China was not a part of. That was when we were talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when RCEP and they were not only excluding China, they were, some of them were sort of inherently against China. And actually the Belt and Road Initiative and everything that it spans is a way of cementing China's role in manufacturing, in supply chains, with all the issues of standards. Well, if China becomes the dominant trading power with access to all these markets, then it becomes a de facto standard setter. And so, I mean, the Belt and Road started as something quite amorphous, but has developed into a hugely ambitious project. Again, one that looks at trade links and trade routes, manufactured goods. Energy is, again, it's part of that because there's continuity. And so all of these outlets, all the port presence, they make sense because they enhance China's trading capacity. And I think for commodities, and you know, as the Chinese become global traders rather than just looking to import, then they will have a presence in lots of ports, lots of trading hubs, and that's one of those.
Well, I think the question is for you, Michael. So historically, some nations have used navies as status symbols of national pride and arguably to the detriment of operational effectiveness. So do you see any element of this in the case of China?
Well, of course, there would have to be some after effect of that. But I think the Chinese have been very studious in their development of the Navy, and it is to promote Chinese trade and security within the context of the global order. And I don't see any problem with that. Why should we be afraid of China asserting herself in the world as is her right as a great power? What I do fear is what has been called the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap, where an up-and-coming power like China challenges a established power like the United States or maybe Russia, and that, of course, was, according to Thucydides, what led to the Peloponnesian War. I agree with Ivan, however, and Michal, that we're dealing here with intelligent leaders, and they're aware of the history here, and I think that the Chinese Navy can be subsumed into the prevailing world order in a peaceful way. One thing that does bother me, though, is that India is a rival of China, and India is on the way of the Maritime Belt and Road Initiative, but is absolutely no participant in the Belt and Road Initiative. And I would hope that we can bring India along into this too.
Well, Michael, one last question for you. So what is, you mentioned the Turkey angle here, but what is the state of China's military cooperation with other countries in the region. And Ivan, please feel free to weigh in on that one.
I think in the Black Sea littoral area, Chinese military cooperation is minimal, except with Turkey and Russia, but that cooperation would be there anyway. The Black Sea is really just, it would be a side effect of that. Now, of course, China is in the Black Sea, and their cooperation with Georgia and Bulgaria is beginning, but it's at a very low state. What I would like to see, however, and this is in my own personal research now, Armenia and Karabakh are both in the Caucasus, and with the Belt and Road moving possibly through Baku, through the Caucasus, through the Black Sea, Batumi and Georgia, hopefully this would bring a new impetus towards peace for Karabakh, and also to bring landlocked Armenia into this equation. I would think would be of a great help to Armenia and would soothe some ancient tensions in the Caucasus. So I see the Chinese arrival in the Black Sea area as a very positive move towards world stability and regional stability.
Well, there is another question. I think that's to you, Michael. China has a long land border with Russian Eastern Siberia. And the question is, why would China be interested in the Black Sea? Sorry, this is for Michal, I think. So why would China be interested in the Black Sea as a transportation route?
Well, I think precisely, I agree 100% that it isn't. There is absolutely no need for China to invest in the Black Sea as a transport route. Again, if and when the resources in the Black Sea are developed, and that adds to the availability of supplies on the global markets, that all things being equal, brings down prices for everyone, makes more resources available, it sort of reshuffles supplies. But I agree 100% that there is no strategic or commercial reason for China to invest in those resources in the Black Sea when it does have the power of Siberia, it's got Central Asian supplies and increasingly seaborne sort of LNG markets where prices are coming down. And so the availability there is ample.
And
I might add something to that. I work with the Shanxi Normal University in Xi'an, China, and they recently at this Shanxi Normal University under the leadership of Yingzheng Li have begun a Black Sea Research Center there, which tells me that despite what we're saying here, that Black Sea is of minimal interest to China, that actually the Black Sea has some interest for China, and that or else this center at the Shanxi Normal University would not be open. Very briefly, the long border between Russia and China in the Far East, this land was taken from China by Russia in the 19th century, and the Russian population is very small in north of China, and the Chinese population is huge. And so inevitably, there is a potential conflict there as the Chinese population inevitably is going to push north into across the border into Russia in the Far East. And this could lead to problems too in their geostrategic situation between Russia and China.
Well, my next question to you, Michal, and I'm seeing that actually there's a similar question from the audience. So my next question is about the energy transition and whether it would create new opportunities for China. So the question from the audience is, Turkey has plans to build a nuclear power plant in Sinop, which is a Turkish Black Sea province. So the question is China interested in building this nuclear power plant? And isn't this a perfect chance for China to have a foothold in the Black Sea and using this MPP port by Chinese ships? So, Michal, to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's sort of one of the elements in the paper and in the report that I agree. The energy transition does offer China potential opportunities in the Black Sea region. China is already the world's largest manufacturer of solar and wind capacity. It is sort of a leader in renewables, in batteries, and also a growing provider of nuclear capacity globally. And you know, China has been looking for this sort of endorsement by third countries. So investing in, I mean, the Hinkley power plant here in the UK, but also the Romanian project and potentially in Turkey, are a way of saying that China is competitive, because there has for a long time been this perception that the Chinese expertise perhaps isn't as good as the West. And so, of course, any country that welcomes Chinese manufacturing capabilities and nuclear capabilities is a vote of confidence. And so that would not just nuclear, but also, again, renewables. And as we move, as the world looks increasingly to the energy transition and more countries pledge to reach carbon neutrality, then China could be a huge supplier of renewable energy, nuclear. And, you know, China's become a big investor in grids in Europe as well. I think the challenge, you know, the Romanian example was extremely interesting, because, again, this was poster child for China. It was something that the Chinese were extremely proud of, and that fell through in part because of US and NATO pressure on Romania, because there is a growing concern in the EU, in the US, about Chinese investments in strategic industries. Now, Turkey is probably a bit more immune than Romania, arguably, to Western pressure of having sort of Chinese investments in strategic industries. But these concerns about China's involvement in these industries is rising. And so in Black Sea littoral states that are sort of close to the European Union, I think there will be a lot of pushback from the EU because this offers China a foothold into Europe's power sector and Europe's electricity provision. And so I think even though that is potentially a huge opportunity, the Chinese are low-cost manufacturers there, again, and often that manufacturing can come with financing and support. But I think the pushback, the strategic and concerns will hinder some of that progress. But certainly I think that is the area for collaboration on energy going forward.
Ivan, one question to you, and the question is, if Russia and China are always going to be converged on global issues and diverged on regional issues, don't you think that China would be the loser in not following Russia in geopolitical crisis?
The reality till recently was that Russia and China were converged globally, but diverged regionally. So the continuation may be that they become diverged not only on regional issues, but also on global issues, or on the contrary, they converge both on global and regional issues. Their experience in the Black Sea in the last 5 years, from my point of view, demonstrates that if geopolitical tensions on the global level escalate, if great power competition aggravates, Russia and China are going to be converged not only globally but also regionally. China doesn't like this perspective, but it looks like they choose it rationally rather than by hurt, rather than because they like it. If I may, I would like to say a couple of words on the Belt and Road Initiative, because in my understanding, the Chinese major interest was to use this initiative as an instrument to maintain globalization, to guarantee Chinese connections to various parts of the world through various routes, by sea, by land, through these parts of land, through those parts of land, through all seas, and so on and so on. The question is that we now see that China finds out that this is quite expensive and the money is not always used effectively. The question for me is, what will China do when they find out that they cannot keep their economic projects immune from military and geopolitical risks? And what will they do if they really find out that these projects do not help to maintain globalization, and deglobalization and mercantilism trends still develops? What will China do? Whether they will close the project or they will fundamentally reinterpret the project so that this project becomes not about building routes to others, but, for example, about binding others with various investment commitments and making those who participate in the Belt and Road Initiative immediate and extended periphery of the Chinese economic and technological system.
Well, Ivan, there's one more question for you. What is your view? What do you think about Michael's statement about the possible friction between China and Russia in Russia's Far East?
That is possible, and that is very widely discussed in Russia. Maybe it was more discussed in the late 90s and early 2000 years. It is less discussed now, but it looks like China, for the foreseeable future, meaning 10, 20 years, doesn't need to grab something, to take something from Russian control, even in Central Asia or other regions, let alone on the Russian territory, just literally from on the Russian territory. For now, China probably thinks that everything what they can buy on acceptable terms is fine. They do not need to take that under control. That's why if you look at it in a numerical matter, you see how many Chinese on this side of the border and what a big scrutiny is about resources, what a big authority on resources. You look at the other side of the border and say, well, so many stuff there physically, but so little people, and you make the consequence like, well, it cannot go for long. China will probably try to take some control of it. I think that it doesn't work in that in that way. China, we see, is quite respectful to Russian sovereignty, to Russian interests, to Russian ambitions, and so on. That's why I think that in the foreseeable future, China values very much that it can stand back to back with Russia and will not jeopardize it with any nationalistic aspirations to grab something from Russia.
Well, Michael.
I'll get back to the Black Sea.
Michael, can you speak up, please?
I'm trying my best. Somehow your tech guy hasn't hooked me up, but I'll get on top of my computer. Can you hear me? Louder. Okay, in the Black Sea area, the Chinese are interested in splitting Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called 17+1 process, where the Chinese negotiate with individual countries to promote the Belt and Road Initiative, whereas Europe demands that Europe speak with one voice to the Chinese. So right here, there's a potential difference of there is a difference of opinion on how to even carry out negotiations and diplomacy here with China in the Black Sea area. And those who are suspicious of China might point to the Chinese attempt to divide and rule here when it negotiates with the Europeans. But I just wanted to add that.
Well, there is a question about U.S. view on all this. and I guess it's a question to everyone. The question: U.S. Central Command is soon to have a Navy admiral at the helm for the first time in quite a while, well, the question that I recognize that the Black Sea is outside that area, but what insights could U.S. military leadership gain from you with respect to continued security presence, for instance, through Navy ships in the Black Sea and the surrounding waters? So,
the U.S. has answered this in part with the so-called creation of an expeditionary fleet, which, as I understand it, means more capacity for the U.S. Navy to move around the world quickly to respond to crises and problems. And this would be one immediate reply to the fact that the Chinese have expanded their naval force even into the Black Sea.
So one last question. Are there any lessons from the ongoing dispute between Australia and China for the Black Sea countries? China is using Australia's export dependence on China to coerce Australia, and this seems to be a growing tool for China to achieve diplomatic goals. So final words on that.
China has been called a cautious bully. In other words, China will take advantage of individual smaller countries, pick them off one at a time if we allow it to happen. So I would say that with Joseph Biden becoming the new American president, there'll be a renewed emphasis in the United States on maintaining traditional American alliances, which would forego this possibility of American allies like Australia being isolated here by Chinese actions.
Any other final words?
Yeah, if I could add, I think we're going to see a very interesting maybe dichotomy or something that seems a bit schizophrenic. Seeing on one hand China really stepping up much more internationally. The mantra used to be hide and bide. It used to be a very subdued foreign policy, and that is changing because I think that there is a perception that there's the demise of the West and that it is happening. And these debates come and go in China, but it is now extremely prevalent that it's China's time. And so it is being more assertive, and we're seeing this sort of this bullying that's happening. At the same time, China remains extremely cautious and concerned about the US, its strategic intentions vis-a-vis China, about technological and other forms of decoupling with the US and the West more broadly. And so we're seeing these efforts to hedge on one hand, but also to assert China's role internationally. In the Black Sea, it could also be a testing ground for China, right? Because there's less to lose, right? If China, already we're seeing that China's not afraid to bully, so to speak, Australia, which is a big trading partner and a big supplier of commodities. But certainly these kind of two facets of Chinese diplomacy could very well be visible in areas like the Black Sea and in Europe. And just perhaps one word also on Russia. Yes, there is a strategic agreement now and perhaps desire to collaborate and put at bay any differences of view. But I still remember a lot of Chinese analysts saying to me that, Sino-Russian relations can only improve so much. And there is that consciousness of the shared border, but also the memory of Sino-Soviet tensions of the 50s and 60s. And so even as Sino-Russian relations improve, they can only improve by so much because there is that degree of caution that is very much Chinese, I think.
Ivan?
I think that the Australia situation is a very interesting and important one. However, I think it matches the general trend that China becomes more assertive. But still, we should not generalize this case too much, because China is particularly now concerned with the COVID topic. And if tensions over the COVID topic go down and China is less accused of how it handled it and whether it is responsible for the global pandemic or not, I think that China may come back to being more cautious. But we also see when China is attacked, it prefers counter-attack rather than just go into deep defense. And coming one more time to the Russia-China topic, I want to tell you very briefly a story. As you probably know, there is an agreement between Russia, formally between the Eurasian Economic Union, but actually Russia signed it. So there is an agreement between Russia and the Belt and Road Initiative, which was signed in May 2015. And Russia offered to China, or Russian experts offered to Chinese experts to discuss this possibility of signing such collaboration agreement in early 2015. And there were debates between Russian and Chinese experts whether we should sign such agreement or not. All Chinese experts said that time that such agreement is impossible. Every Chinese, there were conferences between Russians and Chinese, workshops, seminars. We traveled to Moscow and to China. We discussed it, and all Chinese experts were saying, no, it's impossible. Our leadership will never accept such agreement. And then the Chinese leadership on visit to Moscow on the Parade Day in Moscow in the May of 9th, 2015, signs this declaration. The Chinese experts could not understand why, because all the logic was that China prefers that to be Chinese project. China doesn't want any agreement to coordinate the project with anybody else. China wanted it to be a unilateral project. China didn't want that project to be an economic program of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think that something is going on in the Chinese leadership, which is sometimes underestimated even by the Chinese experts. For me, it was a very striking case when all Chinese experts were sure that the Chinese leadership cannot take that step, and the Chinese leadership exactly took it.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for your contribution. So we thought to wrap up, despite all the uneasiness in the West about what China is doing, or China's increasing a presence in the Black Sea, we thought at the Frontier Europe initiative that there was not enough focus on this issue in the scholarly debates, particularly in Western capitals. So our China report aims to contribute to the debate on the role of China in the Black Sea, and we hope the articles in the report, as well as today's discussion, will help to address several important unaddressed questions. So please go to our website to read our report if you would like to learn more on this topic. And once again, thanks to our panelists for taking the time to talk to us. And thanks to everyone who joined us, who tuned in, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.